final lecture in our Holocaust Memorial program for 1997. We're grateful that you've come and found your way to this new auditorium this evening. We'd like to remind you that tomorrow at noon will be the final Kaddish in the music lounge of the MU. And for those of you who may have come in this door in the back, on this side, outside the door, are numerous booklets written by Professor Kitterman on the Holocaust and the history of the Holocaust. And you're welcome to take those. And if you have someone that you're connected to that would like one, please take one for them as well. Our speaker this evening is Dr. David Kitterman from Flagstaff, Arizona, where he lives, professor of history at Northern Arizona University, where he's been there since 1978. Dr. Kitterman took his PhD studies at the University of Washington in European history, specializing in German and Russian Soviet history of the 19th and 20th centuries, an area he still does his primary teaching in. His scholarly emphasis has been in modern European history, especially German and Russian Soviet history. He is an Albert Einstein Institution Research Fellow, an exchange professor at the Heidelberg University in Munich, a Fulbright Fellow, having taught at the University of Bonn in Berlin. He has been the past president of the Western Association for Germanic Studies, an interdisciplinary body of scholars in history, German language, and social sciences. His areas of current research emphasis are in studying the fates of those who refused to carry out extermination orders in the SS or in other Nazi organizations during World War II, problems of Nazi education during World War II from the perspective of German civilians, and the investigation of the role of German military justice system during the Third Reich and the World War II period. I actually came to make connections with David while visiting with his brother-in-law at another convention, and we felt so fortunate to find out that his specific area of study fit in very well with our program this year. He has just published a book entitled Refusing Nazi Orders to Kill, Germans in Uniform Who Resisted the Holocaust. And that will be his subject for this evening's address. He's lectured throughout Europe and the United States. He and his wife and 5 children reside in northern Arizona in Flagstaff. David, we welcome you here to our program, our closing lecture, and glad that you're here.
Pardon me while I sip a bit of water. I've been developing a frog all day long, and maybe this is the dryness of the airplane flights all the way over. I am very pleased and very honored to be here tonight, ladies and gentlemen, and quite humble, frankly, to stand before you and try to present to you a subject which is a little-known topic, I think, in terms of World War II, and especially about Germans involved in that tragic war, on all counts, a tragic war. It is a research that I kind of stumbled into initially, having heard this said at one point that nobody who refused orders to kill during the Second World War in uniform, that is, whether they were members of the armed services, the Waffen-SS, or the SS and SD extermination squads, that none of those who refused orders to kill were ever killed themselves for that refusal. Now, I might preface that or bracket that by suggesting to you that, in fact, telling you that there were 30,000 death sentences handed down in the German army. 30,000, not just handed down, but actually carried out during the Second World War. Most of them were for things like stealing from the males in the German army. I'm talking about German army and SS and police courts-martials. And some for suggesting that the war was lost 2 and 3 weeks before the war was lost. That was, of course, high treason. So it wasn't that the German army or the men in uniform were not subject to fairly serious and strict discipline. But what I found was most remarkable is that none of those who refused to be involved in the execution of Jews, other civilians, and unarmed peoples, whether they were prisoners of war, combed out of the war camps, especially Russians, none of those who refused were ever executed for that refusal. And when I first heard that, I thought that can't be something wrong here. And indeed, what's wrong is that that story was not told, it seems to me. Now, admittedly, there were not enough of them, and but I think this is certainly a valid, at least, aspect of the Holocaust and of the World War that embraced it, that it ought to be known. So my research is about these German individuals, then, who refused to participate in the worst excesses of the Nazi regime during the Second World War and lived to tell about it. It's the story of at least 137 documented cases in which members individually, or sometimes their commanding officer speaking for the group, in the armed forces, I say, Waffen-SS, German police units, even extermination camp squads, and extermination squads who were not connected with a death camp or a concentration camp in the occupied territories, all refused direct orders to kill unarmed civilians and prisoners of war. I think this little-known theme in German history and in the history of the Holocaust is remarkable in a number of ways. And let me explain why I think that. Among the many kinds of resistance against the Nazis during the Second World War, these men, and except for one woman that I know of that was involved in one of the so-called euthanasia programs, all of them were males. Pardon me. These men participated in a singular way, different from many of the better-known forms of resistance. Many of us are familiar, I think, with the courageous and desperate responses of those whose lands, for example, were occupied by Nazi Germany, such as the Norwegian partisans who sabotaged the heavy water production at Telemark, or the Tito Partigiani, from whom we get that name, the movement in Yugoslavia, or even the Danes who helped rescue the few Jews that they had, but very effectively rescued them across to, primarily got them out across the water to Sweden. One of the most sustained and effective nonviolent resistance movements among these types of peoples in occupied territories was evidenced, I think, by the villagers of Le Chambon in southeastern France, who openly provided shelter for thousands of Jewish children and families from 1940 until the war's end. Or another example would be the very effective children's rescue operation that was going on in Belgium, which also, without regard to race or religion, also involved Jewish children, large numbers in that regard. There was also, of course, resistance from Germans who were members of political parties or religious confessions and other organizations opposed to the Nazis. The best known examples are those, I think, who tried to assassinate Hitler several times. Members of the armed forces and nearly every political group were involved. There were also, of course, less spectacular, but also meaningful efforts at resistance among socialist and communist party members who scrawled graffiti, who distributed leaflets attacking the regime, who committed acts of sabotage against transport and industrial facilities. Individual Germans resisted. There was Georg Elser, a disgruntled watchmaker, who from 1939 smuggled himself into the Bavarian beer hall where Hitler had initiated his 1923 putsch, the attempt to seize power a decade before he actually did. Over a number of months, this man waited until after hours, and of course it closed down fairly late, hauled out and deposited a vast explosive device in the pillar directly behind where Hitler would stand to make his lengthy paean of praise, if you will, to this aborted failure on its anniversary. On November the 9th of 1939, the bomb went off as expected, as Elser intended it to, but It killed and injured many people, but Adolf Hitler had left after his unusually short speech. Was he warned? Was the Gestapo known about this? We're still not certain about all of these things. But had Hitler died, the war would have ended then what? Just a month and a half after it started. Too bad he missed, rather than 5 bloody years later. Elsa was captured near the Swiss border shortly after the explosion, imprisoned throughout the war, and killed shortly before the war's end. I don't know that we still know the full story of that one. The youngest German sentenced to die for committing high treason in World War II was not a member of the armed forces. His name was Helmut Hubener, who was beheaded on October 1942 at the infamous Plötzensee prison in Berlin at the age of 17. The People's Court sentenced this LDS Mormon teenager to death for listening to and transcribing BBC broadcasts, and then passing out leaflets in Hamburg announcing Hitler and the dangerous course of the war this was leading toward. In other words, there were lots of reasons why people were killed in World War II. And not only were they those who were under military justice systems in the armed forces, but also civilians. And in fact, listening to enemy broadcasts was regular capital offense before the war ended. We know about Oskar Shindler, the German businessman who, of course, been out corrupting the Nazis. By that I mean he'd out-corrupted the corrupting Nazis in occupied Poland, who changed course after he became an unwilling witness to the liquidation of a Jewish ghetto near Krakow. And he saved these folks by padding his workforce, as we know, and housing them and their families in his factory work sites. And indeed, at times, literally buying their freedom and prying at least one group back from what I would like to call the black hole of Auschwitz. Raoul Wallenberg, others who were not German, who were not members of occupied territories, or at least were not in danger as diplomatic officials. Perla and other diplomatic consular officials in Hungary, all actively saved many thousands of Jews in the war's final cataclysmic months in Budapest by extending them diplomatic protection. They issued visas to thousands of Jews. They provided them safe houses flying their respective nations' flags. But the men in my story are not resisting their own destruction by occupiers, nor attempting the assassination of the Fuhrer, nor saving Jews and others by extending diplomatic immunity to them. These Germans in uniform were refusing a direct military order in the midst of a terrible war to be their killers. These men were officially, of course, part of the institutionalized mechanism of war, of occupation, and often of Hitler's murders of Jews and other unarmed people. The soldiers or policemen, they were willing to fight and necessary to kill the enemy, but these individuals at least, balked at the wholesale eradication of innocence. These men, I would suggest to you, were in perplexing double bind. They were in military uniform for their country's defense. They were under the constraint of military law to obey orders, whether they were members of the SS or the police forces in the occupied territories, also under the same effective military law. They had to ask the question, is this order not only lawful but morally correct, or one that I can carry out? And if I cannot carry it out, how might I escape? Or will I escape? It's fascinating to see, I think, the successful tactics that were used to evade or refuse such orders. For example, one officer, a major it turns out, when refusing a direct order to be the killer of Jews, demanded to see a legal judicial sentence against those Jews who were supposed to be shot before he would participate. And they had not given one, of course. They had not had any kind of trial. Not all, of course, were that lucky to escape. These men were also remarkable, I think, in that they acted mostly alone, without models or peers or precedent, and certainly not with very few exceptions, without any peer support. Very few of them saw any similar actions or derived moral support then from others. If anything, the prevailing political military climate seemed to at least passively accept, if not condone, or actively participate in the executions of these unarmed civilians and POWs during World War II, and especially of the Jews. Those who refused tried to achieve nonviolent resistance without the force of such phenomena as we've seen most recently with people power, whether you're talking about Corazon Aquino's group, where in the Philippines, or some of the most remarkable and stunning achievements, I think, that swept Eastern Europe and Central Europe from 1989 forward. The decision to refuse participation in killings was a dangerous gamble. These men acted in the face of expected death or severe reprisals against them. The overwhelming assumption during World War II, certainly among German soldiers and police personnel and members of these groups, was that any order given by a superior officer must be obeyed under all circumstances. And they certainly thought, at least those that I had the opportunity to interview that were still living by the time I found them, that they were reckoning with their own death when they made that refusal. They believed that they were manifestly helpless to change the situation, and that any military force that they had at their disposal would also be ineffective, at least ultimately, to resist. And it was only 2 cases that did I find, by the way, anybody trying to use the threat or the actual, the threat really of military force to get out of this kind of thing. And I'll try to at least mention one of these before the night is over. So all of them recognized that they were not dealing with completely rational forces. For example, what rational basis is there for murdering workers, even Jewish workers, if you were proponents of the Nazi theories, whose labor in a desperately labor-short economy, and it got much more desperate as the war went on, in a desperately labor-short economy, it's critical, the labor is critical to the success of the war. Hence, unreasonably harsh punishments might be meted out against those who refused. Their individual resistance, as I've tried to think of some more modern parallel, calls to mind, I suspect, the image of that individual Chinese citizen's determination and the sacrifice that he was willing apparently to make in the summer of 1989 as he deliberately placed his body in front of the tank column near Tiananmen Square and then zigzagged as they tried to move around him. I don't know, we never saw what happened to that fellow after, did we? Hopeless, in some ways, if they chose to run him over. The most remarkable fact about those who refused orders to kill, as I suggested earlier, is that very few suffered serious consequences, and none of them died for it. We know this because their stories, the historical circumstances leading up to their actions, and the results which followed, have been investigated and verified by witnesses and documents, often in quite exhaustive detail. Their experiences were brought to light primarily as rebuttal to the common assertion by all who were placed as war crimes, as war criminals in war crimes trials, just as we're watching right now with the Bosnian situation, because those accused, of course, claimed that they were only obeying orders and that they had no choice, since refusing would have meant their own death or serious harm. But those who had successfully refused to kill, in some of the instances, were found out, were investigated, and some were asked to testify in these trials. And thus, it's primarily legal investigative documents that I've had to work with. And they have some virtues and many failings. And one of the greatest failings, I'll say right up front, is that they were seldom asked, why did you refuse? Which I would love, both as an historian and as a human being, to know. Most of the time, it's just the fact that they did refuse is often the case that we know about. A number of important monographs that deal with the various post-war German war crimes trials and judicial issues connected with the theme of refusal to commit war crimes, including the issue of so-called criminal orders given under duress in an emergency situation, have been written. This is called in German Befehlsnotstand. But most of the post-war war crimes trials, including the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, have confronted this issue of criminal orders to kill unarmed civilians or POWs in an emergency situation, that is, in a situation of a state of war, that were given to officers and men under military discipline. Were they indeed merely following orders? Had they any other alternatives? If so, what were they? Well, the International Military Tribunal came to the conclusion that the defense of following orders was not an acceptable blanket excuse. There were certain extenuating circumstances absolving them. Certainly this blanket excuse was incapable or should not be allowed to absolve all defendants from their personal legal culpability. Knowledge of those who refused became known slowly, and as the subsequent war crimes trials went on, we still have war crimes going on today, don't we? Then the war crimes trials undertaken by each of the occupying powers, at least in the western zones, and to some extent those in the Soviet zone of occupation, later East Germany, also began to use these individuals. In addition, of course, during this period, trials were conducted by German authorities under supervision of each occupying power within their respective zone. After 1950, the new German Federal Republic, the West German government, as it became known, began its own lengthy investigations and trials of accused war criminals. And after 1958, the Central Office of State Judicial Authorities for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, that's quite a mouthful, of the Federal Republic of Germany then coordinated and assisted in these investigations, and it was housed at Ludwigsburg near Stuttgart. And that's where most of these records are housed and where I found them when I began my own investigation. I tried to make as an exhaustive a search of such available records of those who have refused, and for shorthand's sake I'll call them refusers. You understand what I'm talking about by that? How severe were their punishments was some of the questions I was asking. In what percentage of the cases did refusal lead perhaps to death or other serious consequences such as imprisonment? What motives were given by those refusing to kill? What tactics were used to disobey or evade the orders to kill? Now all of these then allowed me to document these 137 instances at least, there may be more. And to my knowledge, every possible source of documentation of such cases has been searched. Additional court cases after the Ludwigsburg complex was worked through in West Germany have been uncovered as the former German Democratic Republic has been now recently united with West Germany, the so-called GDR or East Germany. And at least 2 of these instances were detailed in case studies, and one of them I'd like to mention later on as well. Further archival research of World War II German Armed Forces court-martial records, which survived the war's destruction, I undertook in a couple of research trips, both in the fragmentary records that survived the war's destruction in Western Germany and also in the East, after that was opened up for research in 1991 as well. All of these efforts failed in the military courts-martial records to yield any further cases. There may be some still there, but my fairly exhaustive search did not uncover any. I'm certain that all refusals that took place with their existential moments and actions were certainly not recorded. We'll probably never find out the true number who did refuse. As we know, many of the German Armed Forces records were destroyed at war's end, or deliberately destroyed before the end of the war, or didn't survive in their relocation. The major efforts I'd like to make tonight would be, though, to indicate to you some of the ways in which these people did refuse, what happened to them, and remarkably, what didn't happen to them. One of these chapters of my book details the saga of an individual that I was able to interview, and I was able to interview a few. Unfortunately, many had died by the time I got around to this in the late 80s, and began that at least then. One of these tells a saga of a man named Klaus Hornig, who was a Prussian police officer, later transferred to the German army and then back to the police. And many of the units of the police and of the reserve police units who were sent into the occupied territories as German armed force began to prevail over their enemies, both in the east and in the west, and even in the north, many of these were involved in executions. He was leading a police unit in occupied Poland in late 1941 when he refused orders to kill. In this case, it was 780 Russian war prisoners, some of them Jewish, but they weren't selected for that particular purpose, selected from one of the prison camps. And by the way, as many as 2 million, probably, prisoners of war were combed out of the camps and killed, or even more, a larger number than that, if you added those who starved to death, died. At least over 3 million, if I remember right, of the 5 and some odd number millions of prisoners from Russia died in Germany. or under German control in POW camps, or were shot. He refused these orders. In addition, he gave his men a terse, cogent commentary on the military legal code, which was operative also for the police and the SS. And this, we're talking about the German military law, operative in World War II, which gave them the right to refuse such orders as well. He was arrested finally in May of '42 and ultimately charged by the SS, not with the refusal to obey orders, in this case to kill POWs who were unarmed, but with undermining the fighting spirit of his troops. And for this reason, unlike most others who were threatened with courts-martial or who underwent the investigative process leading perhaps to a court-martial, he went through 2 SS courts-martial, one in 1942, in which he got 3 to 4 years sentence, and the second in 1945 in March, while at that time a prisoner in Buchenwald concentration camp. One of the few who got in a concentration camp, not supposedly for refusing orders to kill, but for undermining the fighting spirit of the troops, but in effect the same difference. Neither sentence, by the way, gave him the death penalty, which Heinrich Himmler had to sign off on. That is, the sentence had to be signed off by Himmler, and he wanted him to be tried and found guilty of treason. And so in some senses, the German justice system, in this case the SS justice system, which was very slow, saved his life. His last trial was held just about 3 weeks before Buchenwald, which is not far from Weimar in eastern Germany, was liberated by American troops in early April of '45. Ironically enough, this individual, after liberation, was almost beaten to death, or beaten almost to death, I guess is a better way of saying it, by others in the group who thought, because he kept being called SS quarters to acknowledge receipt of documents for his various trials, was an SS stool pigeon. He also underwent 2 more years of American internment because he was a material witness to war crimes. So he was, it says, at one point I've heard it said that no good deed goes unpunished. Well, Klaus Hornig's probably life is a good reflection of that. In any case, he is one individual that I've written a chapter about. Let me just say a brief word or two about this individual. Klaus Hornig came from a fairly strong Catholic background in Silesia. Went to school in a couple of universities, interrupted his university studies because of the Depression, he and his brother, and he was able to join the police, the Prussian police force. As you heard, he was transferred back and forth between the army as the army began to expand, and then later back in the police force under Himmler's jurisdiction. In this case, he was very demonstrative about not only his knowledge of SS and German armed forces law. He had just, by the way, finished a dissertation on some aspect of that law when he had been sent to Poland. So he certainly knew what he was talking about and was not at all hesitant about telling his troops that, no, you don't have to shoot either, and here's why. And that's what got him in trouble. Not only that, but he also kept blabbing about it to everybody who would listen to him back in the fatherland. Bad choice. He was originally in prison for several years, but ultimately, when he was released from that after the first trial, he still kept blabbing about it. And this time they put him under investigative arrest in Buchenwald. Now, because he's an officer, he's still getting officer's pay. He's in a privileged position in the camp. He's in part of the camp records division, so he's not under hard labor conditions, luckily. But that's the way German law was. As I said, he did survive the war, but was almost killed by his fellow inmates. Hans Kreitner, another of these individuals. This fellow was an officer of the Bavarian police, again from a strong Catholic background. And both of them, by the way, when they were faced with the order to kill, said, no, I cannot, both because I am a Christian, in this case a Catholic. Secondly, because I am an army officer or a professional police officer, and this is not how things are done. And thirdly, because I'm a human being. and these are defenseless individuals. So they had fairly well-grounded reasons for refusal. That doesn't mean necessarily they're going to escape. And as you heard, Hornig is one of the few who actually found serious consequences accruing to him, and I'll show you this in a chart in a minute or two here. Back to Hans Kreitner. He too came from a strong, very devout Catholic family who found his police agency in the Bavarian police unified with the dread Gestapo in the mid-1930s. And the Gestapo, the Geheime Staatspolizei, the secret state police of the Prussian state, became now essentially swallowed up all the other political police forces, counterintelligence police forces within Germany. And Heinrich Himmler was able to take over the Gestapo from Prussia that originally Hermann Goering had under his control. That's another story. Kreitner, like Hornig, not only refused to kill Jews while out in Poland on occupational duty, but in the last 6 months of the war alone, methodically assisted at least 58 people to escape serious charges in which they would probably have died as a member of the Prussian political, in this case, sorry, the Bavarian political police, but had become, for all intents and purposes, a member of the Gestapo. He did this with a remarkable secretary who came to him and who had been initially apparently a secretary to one of the branches of the Rothschild banking firm, though was not Jewish herself. And they were able to apparently to outfox some of the Gestapo officers in their own bureau, where possible interviewing people who they realized had been caught up in the unequal and certainly unfair criminal justice system of Nazi Germany, so that the interviews would either not be overheard or that she, with the code from him, would record exactly the opposite of what the witness was saying. A great risk, because the witnesses weren't always very cooperative in trying to save their own lives, and sometimes they might have blurted out what was going on. Kreitner also survives the war. He survives 2 terms in the East. Only once did he have to refuse. He was, as all of these people who refused, had to at least suffer the scorn and sometimes the ridicule or dressing down, if you will, of those who were commanding him to do so in front of his comrades, but that was not particularly that serious, at least for these individuals, though for some it may have been. Another remarkable individual, while I'm thinking about those that I was able to interview, is a man who was a Jehovah's Witness and a member of the Prussian police force and a member of the Prussian criminal police investigative force, who had joined the Jehovah's Witnesses early on before Hitler came to power, remained a member of this group, yet again was transferred probably out to the east because of his refusal to bend to the issues of saluting or saying Heil Hitler. He would always say Guten Tag or something like that when the Nazi salute was mainly in vogue, and so it came to lots of folks' attention. But he survives the war. Again, citing his Christian beliefs as the basic cause in his humanitarian commitment to other people. Many members of his faith, of course, were not so lucky. Members of this group of believers were sent routinely to concentration camps because of their fierce pacifism and refusal to swear loyalty oaths to any secular officials, especially to Hitler. My research is certainly not an effort to negate the tragedy and devastation of the Holocaust. And especially on May the 8th, which is Victory of Europe Day, by the way, I would be remiss as an historian to let that go unsaid. Some Holocaust survivors might worry that by spotlighting the singular resistance of a relative handful of German individuals, I would obscure the crucial fact that 6 million, roughly, of the Jewish people, including 2/3 of the Jewish population of Eastern Europe, as well as millions of Soviet POWs and civilians, those who were claimed to be partisans aiding and abetting others, held as hostages, members of Gypsy. The Gypsies, of course, were marked for death, just as the Jews were, and other enemies of the state, that all of these peoples were brutally murdered. Most met their deaths after bearing starvation or forced labor or degradation, torture, medical experiments, so-called, and were the victims of other unspeakable acts. All of this horror, while relatively few Germans or other people across occupied Europe, but yet thousands, but relatively few, stepped forward to prevent these atrocities, either by rescuing people directly or as this handful refusing to be involved in their actual extermination. Any responsible historian freely acknowledges this to be one of the blackest periods of world history. Would that it had served its purpose, that it would never happen again. I'm not sure that we can be so sanguine. But the history of all types of resistance, whether organized or not, whether nonviolent or not, I think merits scrutiny in its own right, and may also cast significant light on non-resistance as we endeavor to come to a fuller understanding of not only the Holocaust, but also of our human condition. This is expressly why I was been interested in this topic now for nearly a decade. Eva Fogelman, in her superb study, Conscience and Courage, Rescuers of Jews During the Holocaust, phrased it quite eloquently. Of course, she's focusing on those who actually did assist people as civilians and other civilians and as they came across them. She said, at a time of worldwide upheaval, when civilian norms or civilized norms were held in suspension, a few individuals held fast to their own standards. They were not saints, nor were they particularly heroic, or often all that outstanding. They were simply ordinary people doing what they felt had to be done at that time. With a few exceptions, they were people who were easily overlooked. She continues, Holocaust scholars, most of them, relegate rescuers' deeds to a footnote, but the moral courage of the rescuers and their actions deserve attention. They are as much a part of that era's history as the gas ovens at Auschwitz. And this book that I'm trying to write, it's not yet published, by the way, but hopefully by the end of the year, it attempts to unearth and recover the history of those few Germans who define then Nazi authority, propaganda, and socialization and pressure, put their own lives and futures at risk in order to act honorably toward fellow humans. Let me then proceed with a few illustrative case histories beyond those I've given you, and then the time that remains also indicate to you, look at an analysis of the reasons they gave for refusing, the methods they used to either to make that refusal effective or to evade it, the order, and then the consequences that happened to them. Because of our time, I will not summarize any further Hans Kreitner or Klaus Hornig. I think you've heard enough to get the information that I wanted to about that. Let me go on to others. One of the most remarkable, beyond those that I've mentioned already, was a man who actually used the threat of armed force to prevent, at least temporarily, the sending of a number of individuals from a city, I'm not sure that I pronounce it right, my Polish isn't very good, Przemysl, help me out if you know it close enough, in Poland. His name was Albert Batel. One man, as I suggested, who refused to participate in the murders of civilians and prisoners of war during World War II deserves particular attention because of his unique story. We know a great deal more about him than some of the others because of his case of open military defiance and resistance against the final solution, which gained him Heinrich Himmler's and Martin Bormann's personal attention, though he remained unpunished during the remainder of the war. In July of 1942, Dr. Albert Batel, who had been a lawyer in civilian life and as a reserve officer, having served in the First World War, is called back into active duty, used the threat of armed force of the detachment under his command against SS and security police to prevent, at least temporarily, the so-called resettlement, which was the euphemism for what, the transport to a death camp or murder of hundreds of Jews working for the German army in this city. He'd been born in Upper Silesia, became a lawyer in 25, as I said, had already served his country in the First World War. He married a young lady in a Catholic ceremony in her native Breslau in 1931, and in May 1st of that year, shortly after the marriage, he became a member of the Nazi Party. He also joined the National Socialist Lawyers League, one of many Nazi professional organizations to this day. He was a Catholic. He was always an individualist. Albert Vattel kept defying the increasing measures of the Nazi Party, especially forcing Jewish lawyers from their practices as the Third Reich got underway. And of course, professionals were excluded slowly and deliberately from this practice that they had. So his party record was a checkered one. Let me give you an example or two. He lent money in 36 and 37 to a Jewish lawyer who was to pay him back in legal work during this period when Jewish lawyers and doctors were being driven out of professions and were not allowed to work for Aryan, so-called Germanic peoples. A denunciation of Vattel, of course, followed and led to a Nazi party court in Breslau with him receiving a warning, and he was put on inactive party membership status for a year. Other judicial investigations of this man indicated his willingness to help Jews prior to the war. Another time he received a reprimand and a 500 Reichsmark fine from the Nazi Lawyers Association. The Breslau police files on this man also reported his quote-unquote hateful attacks on members of the Breslau State Police during a court proceeding as he represented his client. The Gestapo investigation of Vattel, as his case became known to Himmler in 1942 after this demonstrative act, and I'll describe a little bit further here, the Gestapo investigation produced the laconic assessment from the local Nazi authorities that Vattel had produced, quote, no services for the party, unquote. Clearly a man with his own blemishes and his own individuality. He has served about 10 months in this city as the adjutant and ordnance officer to Major Liedtke, the Army Commandant. This city, by the way, was an important transshipment point and quartermaster center for the armed services in 1942 and the early months of that year as Hitler's expedition now not against the entire Soviet Union, but what? Against the southeastern part into the Ukraine and ultimately into Stalingrad began. In May of 1942, there had already been an initial transport of 1,000 young Jews from this city and sent to Janowska camp in Lemberg, where infamous sadists SS First Lieutenant Wilhaus and Lieutenant Rokita terrorized these unfortunates. Indeed, a state secretary of the Reich Transportation Ministry reported to Himmler's deputy, Karl Wolff, that daily transports of Jews were leaving Warsaw beginning July 22nd, and that twice-weekly trains of 5,000 from Przemysl were also leaving for Belzec extermination camp. So Vattel knew exactly what was coming when, in late July, he got word that the SS and SD were about to resettle the Jews still remaining in this city. Many of these, though not all, were working for as forced laborers for the Wehrmacht and were desperately needed to assist in the vital repair and transshipment and warehouse tasks. But Hitler's final solution, the so-called extermination of all Jews under Nazi control, now had higher priority, of course, than winning the war against the Soviet Union. You understand, I hope, that the extermination trains to the extermination camps had higher priority over troop trains and munitions resupply to the front. This was one war Hitler was determined to win, and unfortunately he almost did. These new resettlements of the Jews from this city were to start on July the 27th. 3 days earlier, Vattel and his commanding officer actually persuaded his commanding officer, Major Liedtke, to prevent the forthcoming roundup and execution of Jewish Wehrmacht workers and their families, at least these, by insisting to the SS that these workers were desperately needed in this labor-short district. And so Liedtke, under this man's prodding, Vattel, declared a military state of siege, which effectively then overrode the authority of all German civilian and police units, including those that were about to round up the Jews, at least temporarily. And he gave the following orders to other army officers in their command and to leaders also of the SS and security police in the city. In view, quoting now, In view of the previous actions against the Jews of resettlement, the local commander gives orders to bring all Jews working for the Wehrmacht into barracks and place them under military protection. They are to be fed and housed, etc., so that they remain able to work." End of quote. Well, these orders in the declared state of siege were communicated to the Army field headquarters of the region and requesting their assent and support, and so it gave them at least a bit of a breathing space. These measures would at least allow the Army in the temporary period to remove and keep alive a number of the Jewish workers, already surrounded, by the way, in the ghetto, by SS and police units in preparation for their imminent removal and execution. When it became clear that these orders were not going to be heeded by the SS and police, 2 days after this initial order was given, on July the 26th, Lieutenant Albert Battelle tried to gain entrance to the Jewish ghetto. An SS officer in charge refused him entrance, so Lieutenant Battelle gave orders to a Wehrmacht company and took them back with him, armed with rifles and fixed bayonets, to face down the officer and his few folks so that he could fight his way to the ghetto if necessary. This time the officer of the SS gave way under threat of force and allowed Battelle to take out at least 80 to 100 Jewish workers along with their families, which he relocated in the city's army headquarters. After the war, he told his wife, Katja, that he had saved perhaps 400 Jews in this situation. Pardon me. By the next morning, on July the 27th, Lieutenant Battelle had further persuaded his commanding officer, Major Liedtke, to prevent the Jewish roundup in the ghetto, scheduled to start that morning. He had ordered the bridges connecting the ghetto with the rest of the city across the Seine River closed. And the ghetto was separated from the railway where they had to take them in order to transport them to Belzec by the river bridges. And they're closed to the SS, the Gestapo, and all other security police. They had orders to shoot if the SS and police units attempted to cross. Twice that day, the SS were kept from fulfilling their monstrous tasks through these methods. But only for a short time were they able to keep up this threat of armed resistance. As soon as word was sent to Krakow, the man in charge there, Martin Fellens, chief of staff at least of the SS and police headquarters, along with other security leaders, were sent to the city. And they were there, of course, to essentially trade in human traffic. And they were trying to overcome this inconvenient temporary obstruction. Battelle was able to negotiate concessions from Fellens for certain categories of Jews, a relative success. But after intensive negotiations with Liedtke and Battelle, later that same afternoon, the Seine River Bridges roadblock was lifted by the Wehrmacht. On that same day, in spite of Battelle's and other armies' personnel's fairly brave resistance, I would suggest to you, there were 3,850 Jews resettled from the city. Whether those Wehrmacht Jews, as they were sometimes called, those working for the Wehrmacht and their families that were placed under temporary Wehrmacht protection were saved for the war, I do not know. I don't think so. Complaints by Fellens and others to Heinrich Himmler's personal staff then prompted Himmler to have the case investigated. That's why we know so much about the record of this man, Battelle. In October of 42, 2 or 3 months later, Himmler informed Bormann, the personal secretary and head of the party registry, that it was his intention after the war to arrest Battelle, but not then, interestingly. He also suggested at that time that Bormann should initiate proceedings to throw Battelle out of the Nazi party. What were the direct consequences of Battelle's refusal? And quite demonstrative action, the most demonstrative that I know of. The direct consequences were that he was severely reprimanded by his commanding general, the commandant in Krakow, in August, I think, in fact, later August, in front of the Gestapo and SS officers specifically assembled for that purpose. A written notice of it was put into his military record. He was also stripped of his Iron Cross, second-class award for valor, upon the insistence of the party members, because Battelle's humane treatment of Jews had not been unnoticed. He'd been seen shaking the hands, by the way, of the leader of the city's Jewish council, with whom he had just negotiated a labor contract. It also is interesting to note that this man and Battelle had been law colleagues at law school together, colleagues of the law school. He was placed under house arrest. Ultimately, Battelle was transferred to a frontline unit. However, he was promoted to major shortly after the incident in Premierville. Was that something the Army had already instigated and, of course, the bureaucracy ran, or was it a demonstrative vote of confidence after the fact by the Army? We don't know. In later 42, a court-martial proceeding was instigated against him following this investigation, but his military superiors were successful in stalling it and the investigation and the initiation of the actual court-martial until the German Army's military reverses against their Soviet enemies prevented the trial from going forward before the end of the war. He escaped Himmler's future intentions. Soon after his transfer to frontline service, he followed someone's counsel to report sick, was released from the Wehrmacht in March of 44. He worked as a lawyer once again in Breslau for about a half year until he was called into the Volkssturm. This is the wonderful creation of those who were desperate to save their own skins, the People's Army. What it was is the dregs of those who had not been eligible to fight, but now somehow were eligible because they were on the front doorstep, the enemy. Young men, young boys, some of them 12 and 13 and 14 years old, were sent to the front lines. One of the most heinous pictures that I know of Adolf Hitler is the one where he's patting the cheek of a boy who can't be more than 14 years old. It's 3 days before he commits suicide, if I remember right, because he just knocked out a couple of the Soviet tanks that were keeping him alive for a while, for beautiful downtown Berlin. The Volkssturm led to Russian captivity. His wife, Katja, had fled the beleaguered city of Breslau with their 3.5-year-old son earlier, before it fell. By late 47, they had found their way now west through eastern and central Germany, settling on Frankfurt am Main. Vattel survived the war's end. Taken as a Russian prisoner of war from his service in the Volkssturm, he was released from a Russian prison camp in mid-46. He too made his way west finally, but they were unable to live together because of the extreme housing shortage, and they may also have had marital difficulties. They were finally divorced in June of 49 in Frankfurt am Main. Vattel's denazification court, which almost all German citizens had to go through if they had been involved as party members or members of a party affiliation. The denazification court verdict in 48 denied his reinstatement as a lawyer. He died of a heart attack in March of 52 near Frankfurt. Only when the trial against Ferenc, some of the people involved directly, remember, from the SS and others, in the early 1960s for war crimes revealed Vattel's full actions were his pro-Jewish activities first known and believed. In early 63, German newspapers and magazines gave him full honor for his acts. Eventually, Yad Vashem in Jerusalem posthumously bestowed its highest honor on Dr. Albert Vattel as a righteous Gentile. Unfortunately, this restitution came too late to help him personally. This is one of the few times in which actual military threat of force was used to at least temporarily stay and perhaps prevent, we're not sure, the execution of Jewish peoples and others. The time is short, folks, and so I want to go to the analysis of all of the reasons for the analysis of the types of reasons given for refusal, the motive, the actual things that were used. Let me turn on this and give you, if I can, a bit of information about the reasons given. I think, as I indicated initially, one of the frustrating things as a historian, in fact, is that the records we're dealing with, since so many of them are dead and cannot be interviewed now, is that in a number of cases, the reasons are not given, except that they did refuse. That wasn't important to know why. The fact that they had refused and succeeded was important in legal terms. And so, although there are more than a single reason given at times, that's why the number down there is more than the number of cases up at the top, as you'll notice. 44.5%. We don't know why. They just said they couldn't do it. Well, they didn't do it. 23% humanistic, religious, moral reasons of conscience, I would suggest to you. 15, almost 11%, regarded these acts as illegal and grounded their refusal on those terms in hopes that that would make sense to those asking to do it. 6.6% were suggesting that this would cause emotional disturbance, not to the victims, but to those asked to be the executioners. And often that was enough to get them out, especially if you were involved in what was called a special action or death squad, Einsatzgruppen, out in the east. 5% suggested that these actions were not within their professional role or ethos. 2 of them made the argument that this would be politically disadvantageous. That's an interesting one. And almost 26 to 28, in probably the best known case of refusal, the commander of Police Battalion 101, I believe, in fact, you've had this man speak here before, Christopher Browning, who wrote a marvelous study of this particular police regiment, 101. It was actually a reserve police battalion, sorry. At least in the initial time that he ordered his men to kill several hundred Jews in Józefów in Poland, gave them the option of refusing if they felt they could not, were not up to the task, and he would understand. And up to 28 people refused on that hideous day, in which only 300 survived, those who were old enough, supposedly and male, basically between the ages of 16 and 35 or so, who were sent off to labor, at least for a time. What were the methods used of refusing or evading orders? Again, sometimes they didn't tell about how they did it, they just refused. Again, roughly the same number as before. 8% refused and reported or protested to superiors to give them cover that way. It's not our job. Members of the police forces, members sometimes of the Waffen-SS themselves, members of the armed forces sometimes asked to do it. 6% almost refused by inciting damage to emotional, psychological, or physical health. Again, conscience and religion and moral scruples were used. 4.5% refused on legal grounds, and knowledge of bureaucratic exemptions that they might take advantage of. Almost 10% asked for or resisted requested that should be a transfer or resign if they had to from the branch of service. In one case, a Gestapo official resigned rather than going out in one of the extermination units. 11% evaded. By that, they hid behind a wagon. They busied themselves with something else that day. They got somehow slipped into the cordon surrounding the ghetto about to be exterminated. They did not actually participate. About 7% refused, claiming that execution was not the unit's job. The appeal to the economic consequences for the system saved 2 of them. And 2, one of whom you've heard about, Battelle, threatened force to prevent their participation. In another case, a man, a sergeant or a corporal, I forget, and a private drew weapons to counteract the drunken superior officers' threatening use of a pistol if they did not shoot a group of women they had encountered on the road that were Jewish. And they says, no, we're not going to do it. And then, of course, the commander gave them permission to refuse in that last category.
probably most importantly, what were the consequences for those who refused? By no negative consequences at all, I mean that nothing happened to them except being reamed out or read down, dressed down, if you will, in front of their men or their unit. 37% had no other consequences to them. 2 were sent to concentration camps. For that reason, some others were alleged to have been sent to concentration camps because they refused, but in actual fact they were guilty of some other kind of crimes. 3 were sent to combat units as punishments. Well, combat was the normal route of a German soldier in World War II, at least I thought it was. But that could be a consequence, certainly, if you had some other kind of job. 6 were under house arrest or investigations, which were later dropped. 15 suffered reprimands or threats to send them to the front, in punishment battalions sometimes, or in concentration camps, or they were put on report, but none of those that were threatened, these were not done. That's 11% of the total. 2 officers' units were broken up after they refused for their unit to be involved. That was not the case with Horning, but with 2 others. 16 suffered or had a consequence of being transferred to another unit or transferred back to Germany. That was hardly a serious consequence. In fact, I've read more court-martial cases of people deliberately maiming themselves from the Eastern Front trying to get home. Never mind. 7 suffered demotion or lack of further promotion. Notice that of those having no negative consequences at all, a number of those, more than the 7, were actually subsequently promoted. 33 drove officers to executions or helped dig the pits or were involved in the guard detail. 3 resigned or were removed from their position. Let me make a couple of concluding comments. So I get somebody to turn the lights back on again before I turn this off. Thank you. And then I'd like to open it up for your questions. I could talk on for hours. I know you don't want to hear much more, but I would like to at least give you some concluding remarks. The strong or interesting situation that we have here. These men's actions are remarkable given their assumption of death or serious consequences that would accrue to them. The records are remarkable as that they reveal the lack of these serious consequences in the main. Why did they get away with it? How serious a threat did it pose to the Third Reich? I guess maybe another question to ask. The most remarkable conclusion about this investigation seems to be the failure to find even one conclusively documented instance of a German being killed for refusing to carry out orders to murder civilians or Russian war prisoners or others. Now, there have been several alleged cases in which soldiers refused to be involved, were stood up and shot along with those they refused to kill. All of them have been proven false. I've looked at all the records in Ludwigsburg and elsewhere, and in fact, I've not been able, nor have they been able to find any case in which that actually took place. In spite of general assumptions to the contrary, the majority of such cases of refusal then result in no serious consequences, or very few serious consequences at all. I think another important conclusion is that the relative scarcity of documented instances of refusal by individuals or groups to carry out civilian or POW executions. Unfortunately, very few chose to put their reputations, their careers, or perhaps their lives at risk to avoid committing a crime against humanity. And yet one must immediately ask oneself, as I've often done, would I have done the same? Would you? Perhaps, in some cases, they refused also because the Nazi regime assured them that these actions were necessary to preserve their people in the midst of fighting this world war. Those instances where the uncertainty was evident of the official reaction to the individual's refusal to obey the extermination orders makes one point very clear. There was not a uniform system of terror justice operating automatically against those whose civil and moral courage forced them to declare, essentially, I won't do it. You can do it without me, but I will not be involved. In fact, the opposite is true. In every case of documented refusal of individuals or units to obey orders to exterminate people, the coercive powers of the Nazi system proved to be either ineffective or effectively impotent. And that seems to me to be remarkable. How does one explain the fact that no death sentences were pronounced on these refusers? How does one explain the relative scarcity of military, police, or SS courts-martials being carried forward to sentences by enraged commanders whose direct orders were opposed by such courageous individuals? I am struck by the vast incongruity of the Nazi regime, at the same time carrying out, as I suggested earlier, death sentences on German civilians for listening to enemy radio broadcasts during the war, or for blatant cases of war profiteering in the black market, like selling pork outside officially approved channels. Is that pork barrel? No, it's not. My research is in the extant German courts-martial records in the military archives of the Federal Republic or of East Germany. Documented routine death sentences for stealing fellow soldiers' mail or stealing packages sent to the front, or in the most blatant cases, but only in the most blatant cases of war profiteering. And further draconian sentences were handed down by German armed forces courts on soldiers who, as I suggested, uttered, even in the last couple of days or weeks of the war, that the war was lost, as any fool could see, only weeks before the cessation of hostilities. And by the way, at least 7,000 death sentences were carried out probably in the last 2 weeks of the war that we know about. It appears that the relative scarcity of refusals to kill other defenseless individuals in the ideological war within World War II neither alarmed nor threatened the regime or its military, SS, and police forces enough to pursue the ultimate sanction against them. At least that's one of my conclusions. Most of these refusers were alone. They were isolated in their units. They were not part of a mass uprising against military or SS or police authorities and these murderous orders. Their numbers, neither their numbers nor their frequency posed a threat to the successful ideological, if not the military campaigns of the Nazis. The military, SS, or police courts-martial routinely instituted against all those who willfully disobeyed any military orders were seldom carried beyond the initial investigatory stages for these refusers, except in cases of blatant refusal by officers, often speaking for the units they commanded, where they are essentially being charged, as I suggested with Hornick's case, undermining the fighting spirit of the troops. Those courts-martials which did go forward against these refusers were often quashed prior to having to answer the delicate question of who initiated these murderous orders within the military or the Nazi state. Those few of individuals who did refuse involvement in these monstrous exterminations of unarmed Jews, other civilians, and POWs did so against great odds, so great indeed that few of their peers in the police units or the Death's Head concentration camp guards or the Waffen-SS or the military armed forces and units dared to take this step. That all who said no survived should, I hope, give us all pause the next time when we face major moral decisions against great odds. I'm not sure that we would have the courage to do the same as they did. I would hope that we would, more of us would. And I would suggest to you that we have all kinds of options today to speak out against the same kinds of genocide that began under the Nazis. We could list them on more than 5 fingers of places today that may indeed erupt or have already done so. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for putting up with my froggy voice. if you're willing, I'd like to entertain questions if you have some.
We have a few moments if you'd like to ask questions.
Yes, please.
Is there any actual numbers on the number of committed soldiers that were to the Holocaust rather than fighting them? I mean, I know like they committed to there's a lot of people who
There were far more committed to it, or at least willing to go along with it, than actually opposed it, or openly opposing it. Daniel Goldhagen, whose book I take some issue with in his work, if I can give you the exact title. Hitler's Willing Executioners, isn't it, I think? Has suggested at least 100,000, maybe as many as 500,000 were involved at one time or another. And I suspect, although I can't remember whether he's including military transport officials, guards, as well as those actually in the camps or in the extermination units. The extermination units were very small in numbers, probably less than 10,000. And the number of guards in the camps, I can't remember exactly. Again, not very in the thousands, but not in the tens of thousands. In the Army, there were about more than that, 11 million at one point, maybe more than that. But not all of these, of course, are involved in extermination. However, far too many in the Army apparently also at times were willing to lend a hand or took pictures of it and sent them home. Other questions? Yes?
I would like to make a comment.
Please.
The Nazis used the word extermination because they wanted to humanize us and make it easier for them to murder us.
I'm sure that's true.
I would make a special request on behalf of the 6 million because I am a survivor of Auschwitz who lost my entire family.
Good for you.
My family was not exterminated because they were not bugs. They were human beings. They were children of God. And I would appreciate that you all please remember, instead of saying extermination, say murder. Don't,
Murder, yes.
Yes, because they were murdered. There was plan, destruction, and murder.
Yes.
And I also wanted to thank you very much. This is a very important study, at least for me, and I'm sure for all of us, because it says that much more could have been done. And this is a lesson for the future, that we should never be silent when people are oppressed, no matter who they are, what color, race. We have to stand up in solidarity with the oppressed, never with the oppressed. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Yes, please.
In your research, what kind of feeling do you get about scuttlebutt amongst officers that these kinds of refusals weren't punished severely? Was the word spreading by 42, 43 that someone who refused wasn't suffering death?
Very seldom. Within the SS and the SD hierarchy, the so-called security police and the SS itself, word got back or got out to those involved in the East that one could perhaps claim unwillingness, or not unwillingness, but inability, essentially weakness, human weakness of doing this, whether it was emotional distress or whatever, which is by far, I think, the most heinous of arguments. Disregarding, of course, the emotional, let alone the mental anguish, let alone the death of those that were exterminated. But in those few instances, it was possible. Otherwise, no. Most of those that I interviewed did not know of others who had refused. Most of their families. See if I can control my emotions here. In one case, this Hans Streicher, for example, told his own granddaughter, who was reading the record for me, some of his diary, and embraced him at the end, shortly before he died. But she had not known about his efforts. So even they themselves were often silent about it after the war, because it was not a very popular topic. Yes.
Is this perhaps why not many of the soldiers were reprimanded, just so that it necessarily because of a governmental or.
That's possible. That's a possible reason. They were openly reprimanded in front of the troops, all of them, who refused. And of course, as far as many of them knew in the units, they probably, since they were sent home more often than not, if not immediately, very quickly, it was assumed that they were being dealt with some other way. So that's a possibility, but I think, I'm not sure that that's the most important reason. Yes, sorry.
Did the concept exist in the German army at the time that a command might be illegal?
Yes, indeed it did.
And if so, it didn't have to be refused?
Yes, in fact, I should have mentioned that. Article 47 of the German military law at the time said that you had the right to refuse an order. And the same article, by the way, was in SS and police law, because it was taken over directly from the military penal code. It wasn't well publicized, or it certainly wasn't well tried. Hornig did try it. He got off with a very lenient sentence that first time, 2 to 3 years, and Himmler refused to sign off on that the execution of the sentence, not the execution of the man, because he wanted him executed. So he said retry him, and that's why it took another 2 years to get him retried.
Those who refused to kill
Yes.
were real heroes. However, I was in Germany during the war because I escaped from Poland. And under false name, false identity. And I felt that the fear in general of the population that feared the Nazis, even Germans themselves, they feared their neighbors, they feared the shadow of their own body, and even in family affairs, they were scared to death. So whoever did, as you said, and I'm an example of the goodness of one's heart, a police officer, high-ranking, to whom I had to confess that I was Jewish, because I had no choice. Otherwise, I would be sent in the hands of Gestapo and probably killed by all means. And I took that chance, and he refused to tell the Gestapo who I was. He kept the secret, and I was sent to just a labor camp for about 6 weeks near Stuttgart. And it's a whole story that I'm going to put together in my book. But I knew the atmosphere throughout the whole Germany and the occupied lands, that the fear was terrible. I mean, this is quite, not all of them could act.
That's true.
And I'm not defending the Germans.
No.
By no means. I don't
Trying to
say
understand the
but
circumstances in which this
what's
happened.
true is true. I mean,
Yeah.
the truth has to come out. And in my anger against the Nazis from way back, I have to admit that there were some of them who were very decent people. And
Yes.
because of one of them, I am alive. And I cannot hide it, and I'm not going to lie about it.
Good for you. There were Jews who were hidden right in Berlin through the war. In fact, that's not that unusual, because there were more anti-Nazis in Berlin than probably any other German city. But so that did happen. Unfortunately, there weren't enough.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.